Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode of Front End Center, a screencast series on the web platform for web professionals. My name is Glenn and today I want to talk to you about a CSS feature that's really powerful but I don't see it used all that often, currentColor. So what is currentColor? Well, it's a CSS keyword that lets you set the color of something to be dynamic based on its context. It can apply to anything that needs a color, so backgrounds, borders, box shadows, SVG elements, anything. The best way to understand it is to look at an example. Here we have a simple card on a blue background with a subtle gradient, and a blue inline link that when you hover gets a faint background, which then darkens when you click. We've also got a little toggle here, which goes from light grey when unchecked to the same dark blue when checked, and shows a party emoji. And it has a little box shadow on hover as well. What makes this interesting is the fact that if I jump into DevTools, I can set a different color on the body tag, and everything updates. Now, I'm not running any JavaScript here, I'm not using a preprocessor or anything, this is normal CSS, it's just a behavior that most people aren't familiar with. The link still has its faint background when you hover or click, but now it's a faint red rather than blue. Likewise, the toggle now animates from grey to the same red rather than blue. We can try any color here. Green looks great, hot pink looks pretty good actually, but sadly my favorite CSS color, Papaya Whip, doesn't come up so well, alas. Okay, so today we're going to talk about how currentColor works on a technical level, because I think that's really important for being able to understand where you can use it. Then we'll go through and build up that demo and talk about the particular techniques you can use to make it a bit more flexible. And then finally, I want to talk about what this means for the future of CSS, with a variable specification that's just starting to land in browsers now. I want to start by talking about the notion of default in CSS. Now, this isn't the default appearance of HTML elements, that's called the user agent style sheet, and it governs effectively what CSS rules will already be on the document before your CSS is even loaded. Which is a thing, but it's not the thing I'm talking about. I'm talking about what you get when no rule has been defined for an element and a CSS property. For most properties, there's a pretty obvious default. The default border is no border. The default background is not having a background. The default margin and padding is 0. The default text decoration is, you guessed it, nothing. This is what's called the initial in CSS, and in fact you can replace these values with the word initial to mean default. We can see this in action if we look at something like a few paragraphs of text. I'm going to use Roger Ebert's famously negative review of the 1994 film North. This is just a snippet, but I encourage you to read the whole thing. It's scathing and it's way better than any lorem ipsum generator. We haven't applied any styling to these p tags, but they do have a margin before and after set in the user agent style sheet. If we override it and set it to initial, it resets all the way back to the true CSS default, which is 0. This is the difference between an initial and the user agent style sheet. It's how a CSS reset or something like normalize are able to set certain styles to a common default, regardless of what browser you're rendering in. So now we know what an initial is, let's look at inheritance. Not all properties default to the CSS initial, some default to an inherited value, which means they get, by default, whatever their parent had. Consider this line of text with a strong tag inside a paragraph tag. If we set the strong tag's font family to be initial, we see it changes to Times New Roman, which is an application level or operating system default. The same thing applies for font size initial. It renders at the default size of 16 pixels. If we set a color on the outer element, the strong tag gets it as well, unless we set its color to initial, and it returns to black. In fact, most typographic properties are inherited properties. We can actually use the keyword inherit here to be explicit about this behavior. And this does make sense for these properties because you wouldn't want to have to set things like font family and size and color on every tag you use in a document. Those things should be inherited down the page. And it turns out to be the mechanism by which currentColor operates. In fact, setting the color to currentColor means exactly the same thing as inherit, which is the same as leaving it off altogether. As an aside, you can inherit anything you want. Something like a border is definitely not inherited, but you can choose that behavior if you want. I use this sometimes when I have some nested elements that all have the same padding, for instance. It can make things a bit easier to keep consistent. So now we understand defaults, initial, and inherit in CSS, we can figure out currentColor. So let's go all the way back to the very first version of the CSS specification written in 1996. It was able to draw borders around elements, and it had 3 properties to control it. You might be surprised to find out that the initial value of border width is actually not 0. It's a thickness called medium, which works out to be about 3 pixels in modern browsers. The reason elements don't have borders by default is because border style initial is none. But the border color property doesn't really have a meaningful default. It could have an initial of black or white or transparent, Sure. Or it could be an inherited property, but neither of those make much sense. In some sense, though, a border is kind of like a nested element, and so it could just default to be the same color as the text on the element, which is what they ended up doing. If I set this element's color, then the border changes too. You can actually use these defaults with the shorthand border syntax as well, just by leaving off the width and color. Although I recommend using the currentColor keyword when you want this behavior just so it's more explicit. And notice that this is dynamic. Not only are we specifying the color after the border, we can also change it contextually. And this is why it's so powerful. We've made a declaration that our border color is going to be the same as our text color, whatever the text color ends up being. It puts us on a path of writing styles that are much more flexible because they can adapt to their context. The word currentColor actually comes from the SVG spec, where they looked at the border color property from CSS1 and its default behavior and borrowed it. I'm going to talk about currentColor and SVG at a later date, but I thought I should just mention that the keyword was then copied back into CSS3, where it could apply to not just borders, but anything that took a color. These days, of course, CSS3 is almost universally supported, and currentColor is no different, available in IE9 and above. So now we know how it works, where it came from, and that we can use it in all modern browsers. Let's build something. So here's our starting point. The same demo from before, just without the color. The link has no hover effect yet, but the toggle does at least show our party emoji. Not bad, but let's give it some color. By the way, if you'd like to poke around the source code as it is now, you can head to this URL and check it out. Now, if I set the body's text color to red, it has a predictable effect. It only changes the color of all the text. It's not changing the background or the toggle or the link, and text that should be gray is now red. We'll cover all of those in order. Let's start with the background. I'll just hide the modal for the moment so we can see what we're doing. What we want is sort of a glow effect. So let's start by trying the simplest thing that's a little bit better than what we have right now. A radial gradient from red to black, which is too extreme, obviously, but has a nice shape. So that's a start. To get a desired effect, we need a second color that's somewhere between red and black. But how can we find that color without just trying random RGB values? Well, it can be a lot better to think about these colors in HSL values, or hue, saturation, and luminosity. If you're not familiar with HSL, let me know in the comments, and if there's enough interest, I might devote a future episode to CSS color spaces. For now, I'll assume you know the basics, like knowing that red is equivalent to a hue of 0, a saturation of 100%, and a luminosity of 50%. Now, we can write black as if it's red, but with a luminosity of 0. In fact, the values for hue and saturation don't matter. Luminosity 0 always means black. But writing black in terms of red lets us smoothly move between black and red until we get the effect we want. I think 25% looks good. But blending with black can be done another way. Instead of us calculating the shade of dark red we want, we can use semi-transparent colors and multiple backgrounds instead. You can construct multiple backgrounds either by setting a color ahead of the gradient, or as I prefer, to be explicit and set both a background color and a background image. We can now make our first color stop transparent and it looks exactly the same. But the background color is now shining through a transparent gradient. You can see it if you set the background color to something else. Okay, that looks hideous, but it proves my point that the background color is coming through. Now we can change our second color stop as well. Instead of using red with 25% luminosity, we can simply use black with 50% opacity, since the browser will blend that with the red background and the result will be the same. We can dial up or down how dark the result is by changing the opacity of this black overlay. It looks much the same, but since our gradient now doesn't have any red in it, it's just transparent and semi-transparent black, we can change our background color to anything and the gradient just works, which is pretty neat. And now, of course, we can set our background color to currentColor, restore our modal, and look at them all changing color together. Okay, this is a pretty good start. Let's move on to the next problem. Let's get that toggle working. This one's pretty easy. Anywhere that we were specifying a color, we should just use currentColor, and it should all just work. Okay, great. But there's one more thing we had in the original demo, which is a box shadow on hover. We can start with something 2 pixels below with a 4 pixel blur, which looks okay, but it's too strong. It would be great if we could blend this color with 50% white, but that's not how box shadow works. What we can do instead is use a negative spread radius. This means that our 4 pixel blur is now starting from further underneath the element, and the effect is to give us a more subtle shadow. We just need to add a short transition and we're done. Now, let's look at that link. The first thing you might try to do is work with the background of the link element itself. We've already seen how we can blend multiple backgrounds to get the result we want, but that has a limitation. We could blend currentColor with white in this case, but that would start to look weird on anything but a solid white background. Thankfully, we have another trick up our sleeve. If we start by making our link position relative and adding a pseudo element with position absolute, we now have an element that we can set the background color of, but also set the opacity of. If we change the opacity of this pseudo element on hover, we get the effect we want. Now we'll just make it slightly darker on active and we're almost there. This is pretty good, but opacity is one of the easiest things for a browser to animate, so let's add a little transition. But now clicking feels a little slow, so let's back that out for active. Yep, that's much better. Okay, so now we're down to the last problem, but here we're going to run into the big limitation of using currentColor in this way, namely that you only have one color to inherit. When we set our color on our body element, it gets inherited by everything below it, including our link and toggle, which use currentColor to access it. But if we set the color back to dark gray at any point, we break this connection between the parent and child elements. So we have two options here, and neither are all that good. The obvious one is just to set the color on the elements that need it, but that means we're not using inheritance at all. Previously, both the link and toggle just responded to their context, and that's something to aspire to when designing UI components. We can preserve that by moving the dark gray color declaration only where it's needed, leaving the inherited color for the body and the interactive components. Let's implement this. Previously, our text was just inline in the page, so now we'll have to wrap each chunk in a span in order to target it with CSS. It's a little messy, but it's unavoidable. Then we just need to add this text class and we're done. If we go back to the body and change the color to dark blue, everything inherits the color except the text. If you'd like to dig deeper into how this all works, I've posted the code online at this URL. So we've covered quite a bit of ground building this demo. We've blended multiple backgrounds using gradients, we've used a negative spread radius on a box shadow, and we've used pseudo elements as overlays for our link hover effect. But we've also seen the limitations of having only a single variable to use for this stuff. That's about to change with the CSS Variables or custom properties specification. Right now it's in every current browser except Edge, but since it can't be polyfilled properly, it's not quite ready to use on most projects. What it does is let us use inheritance in an explicit way, by defining variables at one level and using them at a level below. Here we can leave color as dark gray for all the text, but define our own theme color variable. We can reference it on our body's background as well as the link and the toggle. I think the CSS Variables specification is going to have a major impact on how we write reusable components. But if you understand currentColor, you already understand how they're going to work, so you're already one step ahead. Thanks for watching. I hope you've learned something about the internals of CSS or the techniques that are available. If you like this video, or if you have suggestions for future videos, please leave a comment, and if you'd like to see more, please head to frontend.center and subscribe.